Bart wrote a book called How Jesus Became God, where his principal claim is that there is a Jesus of Nazareth, a historical figure, Jesus of Nazareth, but he's not the Christ of Christianity. And how you get from the Jesus of Nazareth to the Christ of Christianity is the exaggeration of many centuries of distortion.
Yes, it's strange now that scholars are now saying exactly the opposite is true. Richard Bauckham has famously said the earliest Christology was already the highest Christology.
Oh, absolutely. This is why it was important to me. And I remember when I first was examining this, I wasn't a Christian yet, but I had the flu. I remember I had the flu. I can remember what I was laying in bed, and I was kind of like thinking about, like, how would this bothered me, because that was kind of the biggest hurdle for me. I believed there was probably a Jesus, but I didn't believe he was the biblical version of Jesus. So I was just thinking as I'm laying in bed sick with the flu, how, I can't remember if Susie might be the one that kind of triggered this idea, but anyway, I knew how these cases work in criminal trials, where someone will say you've tampered with the evidence. It's changed over the years. The only way we can combat that is to show the actual chain of custody, so that the person who's evaluating it, the jury, can see, well, no, I know exactly who touched this and where this property was. So it couldn't have been tampered with. Well, I thought, is there a chain of custody for the New Testament? In other words, who saw Jesus first? He said something. Then who is the person he gave that information to? Because if they chronicled it, we'll know if the Jesus is simpler right away. We'll know that it's super, because it's going to evolve over time. And what Bart is claiming is that in the 300 plus years between the events and the canonization of the New Testament at the Council of Laodicea, somewhere in there, these changes were made over and over and over and over again. But if you continue to find that the first officers and the second officers in the chain of custody are always in agreement in different regions, because there's a chain of custody in Rome through Paul to Clement and Linus, and then downward. There's a chain of custody in Asia Minor through John, and then Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias, through Irenaeus, through Hippolytus, all the way down. There's a chain of custody in North Africa through Peter to Mark and all the school in North Africa. So if you're in different regions, and the earliest versions of Christianity in the first and second officers in the chain of custody are all the same, born of a virgin, worked miracles, rose from the grave, ascended into heaven, you're stuck with that version. You don't have to say it's true. You can say it's not true, but you can't say it's a late lie, because it's neither late nor is it a legend. It's not a lie because it's the same story. It could be a lie, but it's not legendary. It's not an exaggeration over time. So you start to kind of just whittle away at the objections. You're just testing the witness from different angles to see if they measure up. Now, I get it. There will be some people who will say, I don't care. The minute something supernatural enters into the narrative, it's got to be a lie. Are you crazy? It's got to be a lie. It's supernatural. But that exposes the bias against the supernatural. That's all that does.
The oddest thing, other than Big Bang cosmology, as you mentioned, if Genesis 1:1 is true, every other verse in the Bible is at least possible. You can't rule it out. The other interesting thing about this is they seem not to realize that if everything happens by nature, their thinking is happening completely by nature, and they have no grounds to believe what they are thinking is true, because their thoughts have come to them completely simply by the collision of molecules in their head. They're driven by the laws of physics, which would negate everything they're thinking, their skeptical thoughts anyway. So they're not taking into account the fact that our very ability to think requires something beyond the natural. Yes, we're using natural processes, of course, but it's not just natural processes. So atheism, materialistic atheism is self-defeating. And yet, so when someone like Bart Ehrman says this, they're actually defeating their entire argument. But we're running out of time, Jim. I want to talk about what I find very interesting is that even Bart Ehrman will admit that he thinks not only did Jesus die by crucifixion, that Jesus, at least the disciples believed Jesus had appeared to them risen. And so he thinks that the documents are reliable enough for him to conclude, yes, the disciples believe Jesus rose from the dead, but he doesn't give an alternative explanation. Why would he think these documents are reliable enough for him to say that the disciples believe Jesus rose from the dead, but on the other hand, he brings up these minor differences in the resurrection accounts to try and discount the reliability of the scriptures, yet he is agreeing on the major facts of Christianity. He just doesn't think that whatever they saw was the risen Jesus, that it was something else, and he doesn't explain what it was.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And here's how I always see it. You know, everyone's got some explanation for how to deal with these minimal claims. If you don't want to call them facts, fine. But there's minimal claims that are in Scripture. Interestingly, you have to trust the Scriptures enough to make the argument to begin with. Like you have to pick out the things you're going to try to contradict, or pick out the things you're going to try to nitpick. But where are you getting those from? If you can't trust the documents, you can't trust the documents. Can you trust the documents just enough to find the things you don't trust? That seems to be a bit of a contradiction. But more importantly, you'll notice that there are a number, and I think Bart, to his credit, has kind of tried to come up with another view. I think one of his books talks about how for many years, I do believe, I could be wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Bart accepted the idea of the empty tomb.
He did at one point.
Most
he
recent
seemed to have changed.
Yeah, he changed that, and he basically says, hey, you know, it could be that one person sees something, hallucinates something, he wants it so badly, but he's in a position of influence that it could then be used to leverage that influence to convince others. So you don't have to have a bunch of people in a group hallucination, because he rejects that theory. You don't even have to have a bunch of people coming together to lie in a conspiracy, because he rejects that theory. He even, in some ways, is contradicting his own idea that the story has been manipulated over time, that this is a legendary addition to the Jesus story. Because now, to make this claim, you're saying, no, it's not a legendary addition. It's the addition of somebody who had a hallucination but was influential enough to convince others. Here's my point, is that it turns out that there's maybe 6 or 7 alternative atheist explanations for the resurrection. There's the Christian explanation. He just rose from the grave. But some people think he lied. They lied as a group. They hallucinated it. They were mistaken. He wasn't really dead. An imposter stood in on the grave. One influential person had a vision and convinced the others. It was just a distortion over time as the legend. Okay, whatever your view is, they all know these views don't work, which is why there are 6 alternatives to the one claim of Christians. Because it turns out that if you're somebody who holds to atheist explanation 1, you reject 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you believe that number 3 is the correct, you reject as unreasonable 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. Each atheist who makes a proposition about this knowingly rejects the explanation of all the others. They think that so it's atheists disagreeing, that they're actually agreeing with us. Those other atheist positions are not true. They're not even workable, which is why they've picked the one they picked. And they don't agree because none of them work. So the simplest and clearest explanation, though, would require you to embrace a difficult truth, that something supernatural like a resurrection actually occurred in the 1st century. But if the only thing keeping you out of that difficult truth, quote unquote, is that you have a presuppositional bias to the supernatural, just remember, you're thinking right now with a mind that you think has the freedom to think. That's immaterial, which is, as Sam Harris has already talked about as a neuroscientist, doesn't even exist under atheism. You can't have a mind that has the freedom to think without being confined by physical prerequisites, right? Neurons that fire that cause a certain thought to appear to be free when in fact it isn't. It was predetermined by the sequence of firing. And that goes back all the way to the beginning of the universe.
In other words, that then, yeah.
Yeah, why trust that? Why make an argument for this? I'm just predestined to believe it. But the point I'm trying to make is that we have good reason to believe that something is governed. This is why when Thomas Nagel writes Mind and Cosmos, Mind and Cosmos, yeah. Yeah, when he writes this book, he recognizes that we're going to have to adapt as atheists to a view of the world that at least holds with an open hand the notion that there's something other than physical processes that are governing our universe. He's not a believer. He just sees the problem. And so this is why I'm going to hold I had at some point to say to yourself, okay, can you hold your bias against the supernatural with an open hand? That is, after all, the thing we're actually examining. Could you imagine deciding when I come into a room who the killer is before I even look at the room? I just know it's going to be this killer. Okay, that's not the fair way to run the investigation. I cannot come into an investigation of a supernatural claim like the resurrection by first rejecting everything supernatural. I have to hold it with an open hand. That's why that presuppositional bias is actually an investigation killer. It keeps you from even starting because you think you know the answer before you begin.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jim, you cover this so well in Cold Case Christianity. And friends, you probably know this, but there was an update to Cold Case Christianity a few years back. So the classic book has actually been updated. And I love that part about the chain of custody. That's kind of a unique contribution to that book there, Jim. I have it right up here on my shelf here. So friends, coldcasechristianity.com, Cold Case Christianity, the book is going to be very helpful. One last thing, Jim, that strikes me as odd too. Notice that people like Bart Ehrman, they attack these details that, even if they're contradictory, don't in any way touch the credibility of the bigger issue that all the witnesses say Jesus rose from the dead. It's kind of like that old that old truth that the witnesses of the Titanic disagreed on how it sank. You know, some said it went down whole, others said it broke in two. And of course, you might figure out why they disagreed. You know, they were in shock. It was dark. They had different angles on the ship and couldn't see it break in two if it did, you know. But they all agreed the Titanic sank. Nobody would say that because they disagreed on how it sank, the Titanic didn't sink. They all agree on that. Isn't that kind of the same thing going on here? He's harping on these minor, trivial things that, even if they are contradictory, don't affect the larger point that Jesus rose from the dead.
Oh, you have to bring this up, don't you? You couldn't let us get out clean. You couldn't. You have to bring this up.
You got 5 minutes, man. We got to go. Go.
Okay, so you had to bring this up so I can say the controversial thing. But let me just tell you that in criminal trials, we have a jury instruction. Here's what the jury instruction is. A witness can be wrong about a detail, yet still be considered reliable by the jury.
Oh.
That's just a jury instruction. I'm sure it's in every state in the land. Now, so again, if I say this, then everyone says, oh, you're saying, Jim, that the Gospels are wrong about. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if you want it for the sake of argument, to say, oh, this is a jury instruction. There are no inerrant witnesses. There are no infallible in criminal trials. There are no inerrant, infallible witnesses in criminal trials. Yet we convict people all the time with sufficient evidence. You're not trying to convict somebody beyond a possible doubt. That's a huge, high standard you're never going to reach. I've never reached it in any criminal trial. The highest standard in the land, because of human fallibility, is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a lower standard. Why? Because we are finite humans who have a finite ability to even assess evidence. And you cannot hold as the standard possible doubt, because anything and everything is possible.
Sure. Yeah. It's
reasonable doubt. And here's what that means. It means that you have to get comfortable with witnesses who are going to make mistakes. Yet they're going to tell you something true you can act on. They can be true about the major things, wrong about the minor things, and still be considered a great witness for your case. We tell this to juries all the time. So even if, just for sake of argument, you wanted to say, okay, Bart, you're right about all those things. So what's your point? If these were criminal trials, you still would convict that guy.
Yeah.
You're stuck with this guy. Regardless, you can say, well, yeah, he got the wrong. He's wrong. It's not a turquoise shirt, and it was a long sleeve shirt. It wasn't a blue short sleeve shirt. So, okay.
Yeah. So he's still guilty. Yeah,
he's still guilty.
Okay.
Yeah. So so this is something that I think can be controversial, because we're not making claims right now about what set of contradictions we would just say are flat out wrong. But here's what I do know. I don't think you have to jump to some literary device to realize that. And what I see often in the scholarship, and I don't even consider myself a Christian apologist, Frank. I'm just a dude who got saved through apologetics, because I was a detective before. So I'll just tell you, though, that if you never talk to eyewitnesses, I certainly am not going to jump to a certain genre of literature from the past. Like in the 80s, this was what people said about. No, I'm not doing that, because it turns out this is what all witnesses do. We get some things right, we get some things wrong. Sometimes we get everything right, but we speak them in a way that it appears to be wrong. Right. Our job as the detectives are to make sense of all that without just assuming everyone's lying.